We are here today with Professor Peter Boettke. He's University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University. He's also Director of the Frick Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And it's such a big pleasure to have him here with us at this Fundación Libertad video. Professor Boettke, so pleased to have you here. It's such an honor and such a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to have an opportunity to talk with you.
We have a lot of questions, a lot of things to ask you. It's been quite a hectic year. It's been quite a hectic week as well, because it's been only, when we're recording this, a week from Super Tuesday in the States, which also poses a lot of questions about institutions, about elections, about how people choose things and how people regulate stuff as well. Maybe it'd be a good idea to start talking, not about that, which we'll talk in a few minutes, but mainly about the ideas of liberty and economics and the teaching of economics, which is something that you have written extensively. I myself am not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but I've always been interested in how different subjects and different disciplines have different and varied approaches when it comes to teaching. What would you say is the main point of interest and the main idea when it comes to teaching economics, Professor Boettke?
So I think the greatest strength of economics as a discipline is that it's a way of thinking, not necessarily an object of study. So it's a big mistake to think of economics as only studying market relationships. It actually is a way of thinking about the world in all of our relationships, recognizing that individuals face trade-offs in all of their walks of life. They have to know how to negotiate those trade-offs, and they need tools to help them reason through those trade-offs. And what we do as economists is we study the implications of the fact that we live in a world of scarcity. As a consequence of that, people must engage in these trade-offs. In negotiating these trade-offs, they utilize tools in a market context, such as property, prices, and profit and loss. And if they're in non-market context, what are the proxies that do the same kind of things as property prices and profit and loss? So just so that we are clear about this, what property rights do is they give us an incentive to care for resources, to improve resources, to trade resources as we desire. What prices do is they guide us in our decision making. They help us, they're signposts. If the price is going up too high, we become more economizing with respect to the good or service that we're talking about. As prices fall, we end up by becoming more, we consume more of them or whatnot. And then profits and losses, what they do is the profits lure us and the losses discipline us. And so it's this entire issue of being incentivized, being guided, being lured, and being disciplined that you have to find in all these other walks of life when you don't have property, prices, and profit and loss, or in an economy which attenuates those rights. So in an economy like the United States or in Argentina, where the government starts to play a major role in either controlling prices or attenuating property rights, that's going to give its own set of incentives, guides, luring, and disciplining that we have to look at and study. And so to me, the fascinating thing about economics is that it's the study of purposive human action in all of the realms of human interaction. And we study the social context within which people make their decisions. And so if I could just say one last thing about that, I know I'm a little long-winded here, but to me, economics, again, since it's not about an object of study, let's say the market, or so that I study commerce alone, but it's also the case that it's not a set of tools and techniques. So it's not just a set of tools and techniques, supply and demand curves, sort of sophisticated statistical techniques or whatever. It's actually a tool for the curious. So what people should be, what you want to do when you're teaching students is you want to enlist their natural curiosity. And that curiosity could simply be, how come this market emerged, or how come this institution emerged, or this practice? Or it could be, why is there such crushing poverty, in this area? Why is that? So some kind of thing that we are curious about that excites our imagination. Economics is a tool, it's a golden key that we as instructors help our students learn how to turn that key to unlock the mysteries of the universe. And so to me, as teachers, we should be enlisting curiosity.
Such powerful statements, Professor Boettke. I was just thinking about how strong the idea of how losses discipline us, which you said, really applies to our everyday life, in a sense that we usually remember our losses more than our wins, and we usually feel them even more. And you also just said economics not a set of tools and techniques, but rather a tool for the curious and a way of actually engaging with what happens around us and in trying to discover how things are the way they are, and if they could be different, and if so, what might entice them or propel them into being different. You just mentioned the US, you just mentioned Argentina. You probably know, because you're an expert on all these issues, that Argentina is a country that, while it uses its own currency, the Argentinian peso, it's a country that it's always worried about the US dollar. It tries to save in US dollars. Everybody in the country follows the currency exchange rate, and they are always worried about it. What can you tell us from your expert point of view about the US dollar in the future, Professor Boettke?
Well, if I knew the answer for that in any kind of serious way, I'd be in international currency markets, and you would have to pay a lot more to talk to me. Let's put it that way. But so I wouldn't trust too much. I do have a book coming out with Dan Smith and Alex Salter, which is on money and the rule of law. And it's an examination of what are in assuming a world of a central bank. So not alternative monetary institutions. So for example, in Argentina, the experience that you had with a currency board, which actually ended badly, but didn't need to end badly. There's a whole story behind that, which Argentinian economists should be studying and communicating to people. And it has a lot to do with the lack of fiscal discipline in your regional governors. And so that put pressure on the currency board, so that the currency board either had to put the discipline back on the regional governors or break. And unfortunately it broke. And so in many ways, ever since that experience, the concepts of neoliberal reforms, in addition to the fact that the government at that time was corrupt and some other things that happened, right? But it sort of put a damper on neoliberalism in Argentina that it's never really recovered from, in terms of the intellectual culture and everything, as far as I understand. And so I think these mistakes have very serious ramifications when people get them wrong, and politics undermines them. But to your point about the US currency, let me just say the following. I think in the United States, we're not having an adult conversation, okay, about three issues. And they're not new. They've been around for over a decade now, but we're refusing to have a conversation about them. And they're interrelated to each other. The first one is the fiscal gap. That is the promises that the government has made to the citizenry and the ability of the government to pay those promises in time. This is what's called intergenerational accounting. All right, this is a big issue. And our fiscal gap is significant. It's well over $200 trillion, and probably, I haven't even looked at the most recent figures, but probably blown up even more because of the most recent expansions. That puts a very big pressure on either defaulting on those promises or monetizing those promises, which gets us to the second point. which is that ever since 2008 and the extraordinary measures that were given to the Fed, we don't have a end game strategy for the Federal Reserve System, how to unwind and examine the Fed's balance sheet. We've been at the zero lower bound for a decade, right, of pushing out money. And under the current regime, we chose to give even more extraordinary measures to the Fed to actually be an engine of fiscal policy, which it never was designed to be, to fight COVID, okay? So how are we going to unwind these extraordinary measures of the Federal Reserve System and get sound money back by, you know, taking care of this Fed's balance sheet? And then the third one is structural inequality in America. And so while it is the case that mobility and social mobility in the United States is still evidence, it's still in evidence, we're not as fluid in our mobility as we were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. That's because we become a more rent-seeking society, right? And so we now have more privileges being doled out by government to protect business against the rigors of competition. This is one of the reasons why you have the difficulties with big tech and all these things like that. It doesn't have as much to do with the idea of that a platform economy is a natural monopoly as much as that the platform economies have special privileges that governments have granted to them. That's why, you know, they lobby the government, you know, for so much, right? I mean, this is what they're getting from it. So we've gummed up our labor markets. We've saddled students with debt in the student debt issue that are, you know, put people behind the eight ball to start out their life. And so we have to have a serious conversation because the natural proclivities of government, whether or not you're in Argentina or in in Europe, in the EU, or in the United States or anywhere else, is, as Adam Smith pointed out, you know, centuries ago, which is that governments, ancient as well as modern, have a natural proclivity to run deficits, accumulate public debt, and debase their currency to try to pay the debts back. Okay? Smith referred to this as the juggling trick that all governments engage in. Deficits, debt, debasement. Deficit, debt, debasement. And when this is allowed to get out of control, it's an economy killer. So when you look at the death of the Roman Empire, if you look at what was leading up before the French Revolution to what was going on in the ancient regime, right? It was the hyperinflation and all this stuff. What was going on in Germany prior to the rise of Hitler, right? You have hyperinflation and everything like that. It's because the deficit, debt, and debasement aspects of the order get out of control. So part of the way to understand modern economics is that there's those who believe that the jugglers should have their hands tied or the objects of their juggling taken away from them, or those who believe we should train economists to be master jugglers. All right? And so for the vast majority of history of economics, from Adam Smith through John Stuart Mill up into, you know, into the 20th century, mainstream of economics believed that we should tie the ruler's hands. We should tie the juggler's hands. So you get best practices, you know, like a kind of a what Buchanan calls the old time fiscal religion about, you know, budget discipline, or you get monetary policy, you know, determined with Bagehot's rule, right? Which is that the central bank is a lender of last resorts, but it should only bail out those firms in a crisis that in fact are solvent, never bail out the ones that are insolvent, right? But what's happened since the 20th century and the Great Depression was that Keynes and Keynesianism in many ways taught economists to become master jugglers. So not to tie their hands, but to learn how to be more, you know, adept at juggling under more and more difficult circumstances. So imagine you're a juggler balancing with one foot on a ball while the world, you know, is tipping down or whatever. That's what Keynes is trying to get you to do. And that's what, like, all of our government agencies in the European Union, in the United States, in Latin America, that's what they've all been trained to try to do. And now you can see why a currency board is a different type of way to do that, right? Because the reason why we got the currency board was an effort to try to tie the ruler's hands, right? And so, or dollarization. Right, this is another way which takes place, which is take the peso out of the political hands and tie it to a dollar, which then puts it where though? Puts it in our hands. And our problem or your problem is that we've become, we are no longer committed to sound money, right? That's not what we're doing. We're trying to use as the old adage went, we don't worry about balancing the budget. We worry about using the budget to balance the economy. Well, now we do it with monetary policy as well. So it's monetary policy is designed to try to offset and not provide macroeconomic stability, but to offset any downturns. And so we've moved off the rule of law approach to monetary policy, and that's going to have consequences down the road. And that's what my book, it's coming out with Cambridge 2021, Dan Smith and Alex Salter. Maybe you could put a link to the page for it. And it tries to make this argument, and in the process of doing it, it does a survey of the ideas as developed by Hayek and Milton Friedman and James Buchanan, and tries to take those ideas and then apply them to the world that we live in today. So,
to be honest, now I cannot wait to read that book, Professor Boettke, and so many ideas and threads to follow from what you just said in the last couple of minutes. I'll try to walk with you through some of them because all of them were interesting, and it's obviously impossible to pick them all up. You mentioned the EU, you mentioned central banks profusely when you were just talking to us. So two questions tied into one. What's your current professional opinion about the EU? And we talked a lot about the US dollar, and we talked about the Argentinian peso, which pales in comparison and looks like monopoly money when you try to balance it out with other currencies. Tying your perceptions about the EU, what about the euro? Do you think that monetary constructivism or limits to central banks of weaker countries is the better idea?
So, in many ways, COVID has taken the conversation in a whole different direction. So we would have had a different conversation a year ago, and we would have talked about, like, let's say what would normally happen in a country like Greece, and where they would maybe default on their currency and then not be able to, trade for a while, but then they would adjust and, move on from there, and how the ECB, made commitments to be able to, do that. And there's a legitimate debate among economists about whether or not the ECB provides a discipline like your currency board was supposed to provide a discipline to your regional governors, whether or not the European Union forces the discipline on the local governments to get their fiscal house in order because of the rules of the But look, all of that is out the window now because, we had this existential situation, a public health crisis. There's very little variation in the model that people have chosen about how to fight the COVID crisis in Europe or in the United States. For as much as people want to, say that there really isn't as much variation. I mean, Sweden would have a different variation, but pretty much everyone followed the same kind of policies. Look, 2020 is a very difficult year to get accurate information from the US because we were in the midst of a political campaign. So people mistake noise for what was really going on. This includes even simple things like the amount of compliance with mask wearing. So like if I imagine in Argentina or friends of mine in Europe, they somehow think, every other American is screaming and not wearing a mask or something like that.
We think that from abroad it happens.
But it's not true. I mean, if you look at compliance rates, we have like something like upwards to 80% compliance with masks in public spaces and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that it's not an issue, but like it gets magnified in a way. And part of it, of course, is what you were talking about led up to the election. And so this was all part of the whole thing. And even yesterday, the fantastic news about the Pfizer, trial and the 90% effectiveness became noisy because of politics rather than just celebrating this amazing scientific achievement or whatever that people and entrepreneurial achievement. And hopefully we can talk about that a little bit. But to me, I think that, so there's so much pressure on the fiscal side to offset the demand by government to shut an economy down. So this is not your normal economic recession, because it's not a recession that was grounded in a boom and a bust. The bad monetary policies prior to COVID may in fact exacerbated the problem, but that's not what happened in March, April, and whatnot in Europe and the United States. What happened in those situations was the economy was put into suspended animation. Government decreed that production, except for what they called essential production, had to grind to a halt. Now, when we sit there and we study and we look at things like Google data or whatever, we can find that people were already taking into account in their risk portfolio that they weren't going to go and do as much things and stuff. So the economy was going to take a hit, but it wouldn't have shut down completely, right? Just stop. And so the government's mandated this shutdown, and that just ground the economies to a halt in Europe and in the United States. You can't imagine, I think this is the wrong mentality. Understand something, I think it's the wrong mentality. But imagine if you think of the economy as an army base, and you're the general, and you tell everyone that they have to shelter in their barracks because there's a disease. You then, as a general, have a moral responsibility to make sure that everyone gets their food, gets the things like that. You do that. And in this kind of situation, that means that expenditure fell on the government to do. All right, to provide, because otherwise, now you're telling people they can't work. Well, how the hell are they going to pay for their rent, right? So, we did all these things like that. That put all these deep pressures on the fiscal over in Europe and here. And so how are you going to get out of that? It's more like, not like coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. It's more like recovering from a war-torn environment, like coming out of World War II. And how do you reorient your economy? We're seeing, by the way, that the economy seems to, if we get the promise of this vaccine, that the economy has so much pent-up demand and excitement and everything that you're going to coordinate around very quickly. So this is going to be a game changer if you have a 90% effective vaccine. It would have been, I'm not wishing this, by the way, I wish we had 100%, but it would have been a very interesting thing to study, to see what would be the tipping point expectationally if a vaccine would have been harder to come by and we would have found more therapeutics. So we still have the disease out there, but we have better treatment protocols. So that means we get sick, but we don't get to the hospital, right? How would the economy have come back? Like, and what norms would have stayed? Do we shake hands again? Do we, kiss each other on the cheek twice, right? Or do you just bow and these kind of things? So I think if we get the vaccine, that's a totally different game changer, especially a 90% effectiveness of that. And hopefully, knock on wood, that's what it seems like we're going to get. But we're still going to now have this huge fiscal problem, right? We have this huge, because we, basically we took a 10% cut in the world economy, GDP, 10% cut. So we're operating on a 90% economy, going to try to catch that back up again. And at the same time, we have now these new fiscal obligations. Airlines, like what the hell, right? When are we going to cut the airlines off of this? When are you going to cut the universities off, right? Universities are on a lifeline right now. And when are you going to cut that budget cord off so that they can now operate on their own again? That's all going to be politics now. And so it becomes, and the more the fiscal side is in balance, the more pressure to monetize that is on the monetary side. So you asked me about the European, the EU and the ECB or whatever. We're in a weird situation because, for example, in the United States, the dollar is still the international reserve currency. So we can kind of get away with things that other people can't get away with. And it's still the case that the interest rates are so low that borrowing seems to make sense, right? That's why we're doing it. And so, this is going to be a very interesting adjustment process. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but it does seem to me that all of the standard economic warnings about deficits, debt, and debasement should be in front and center of everyone. But we always have to recognize that there's offsetting factors. So the forces of deficit, debt, and debasement are being played, but they're also being played in a world where you have technological innovation, right? And so the technology, so we might have inflation, but it doesn't look like the same kind of runaway inflation that you would have had in Argentina in the 1970s or whatever, because we now have so much improvements in our technological base that puts lower cost of production in. So rather than prices falling, they're still rising, but not rising as much as they would have had we just assumed other things constant. And this is where the art of economics, science of economics meets up with the art of political economy, and it makes it, I find it fascinating, but very frustrating to other people because they're like, can you economists predict anything? And it's like, yes, but no, at the same time. So I'm being a little long-winded, but my view is that there's a great book that people discount all the time by David Stockman.
Yeah.
Called The Great Deformation. I think it's a fantastic book. And it's, I think, a really good exercise for a young economist, whether or not they're into Austrian economics or trained as a Chicago monetarist or as a post-Keynesian, is to go through Stockman's book and try to pinpoint where they think the argument is wrong. All right, so go through and then identify where they think the argument is wrong. My hypothesis is that they would have a hard time identifying where they think the actual argument is wrong. But what Stockman might be missing is the offsetting variables. So he's giving us a worst case scenario. Imagine everything is frozen as it is right now, and then we just play out the forces as Stockman lays it out to be. We would have a depression, which was a worse depression than we've ever imagined, right? But what if all these offsetting technology, trading opportunities, new innovations in finances, all kinds of things like that are going on that offset the negative consequences of the standard drill of deficits, debt, and debasement and deformation. Because you got to remember is as we debase the currency, what we're doing is we're deforming our economy, right? And that deformation of the economy is what needs to be recalculated, which leads to the boom and the bust. So the deformation is the boom, the bust is the recalculation, right, that goes on.
Yeah.
And so, so I think that we're going to have economic disruptions, recalculations, and all of that. But we also have a global trading zone. So as long as we don't go to shut down technologies and shut down trading, tomorrow's going to be better than today. Okay. But if we shut down trading and we shut down technologies due to regulations or protectionist policies, then we have a real possibility of tomorrow being worse than today, right? And so the interaction effect is going to be quite fascinating, I think, to look at.
So many interesting points, Professor Boettke. We've just been circling around a couple of current affair events that have been taking place in the last few days, in the last few weeks. You just mentioned the vaccines. I'm going to share a tidbit with our audience because in Argentina right now, for the past few, since last week, from this recording, the government has said, and they have been on record, Argentinian government, that they will be acquiring the Russian vaccine, Sputnik 5, yes? They will not only be doing so, but they will also be getting a lesser amount of doses from the Pfizer one, from the Oxford AstraZeneca one. But you just mentioned about the Pfizer one, and we are going to mention it again because it's the only one that has already released some of its phase 3 results, which is a story of entrepreneurship and how the private sector can work to try to find solutions. Mostly people in Argentina have been quite vocal that they don't want to receive the Russian vaccine, that they do not want to be inoculated with it, but that they might be willing to do so with a much bigger percentage when it comes to the Oxford one or the Pfizer one. What can you tell us about your vision on this vaccine run race?
Well, I mean, look, I mean, science in real time is always a very complicated thing. Just in general, without even including all the politics involved, it's just science is a dynamic, fluid idea, and if we knew what the results would be, we wouldn't call it research, right? So, you know, we're taking a voyage into the unknown, and we're trying to do that. There's all kinds of fascinating issues with the Pfizer thing because they didn't accept the money from the Operation Warp Speed, but yet they signed a almost $2 billion, contract with the government for the for the doses, right? So this is a difference between what the Nobel last year's, not this year's, but the year before, Nobel Prize winner Michael Kramer calls a difference between pull versus push views of research funding, and winning a tournament because you came up with the cure is a pull, whereas funding your lab is a push. And Kramer argues that the incentives are stronger when we have pull rather than push, because when you have push, you're funding the process, not the outcome. But when you have a tournament and you get the pull, what happens is you strive to get the output. So, you know, I think that we can learn lessons, not a perfect experiment of it, but we can learn lessons from Pfizer and what they did. By the way, I also should point out that Lilly has new, therapeutics, which are very promising as well. And I wrote an article back in the spring. So, my point about science in real time, between March and June, I wrote quite a bit about COVID and everything going on there, and what was positioned. And since that time, I haven't written much. And it's not that any of my earlier comments, I was very careful. I always, not careful in a strategic way, careful in a thoughtful way about the science and what was being learned and everything like that. I talked about the incentives that FDA faces. I talked about the incentives that politicians face in the way that they handle a crisis. And I have an essay in there where I say we don't need a cure to reboot the economy, but what we do need is we need mitigation strategies. That is better therapeutics, better practices so that individuals individualized suit that protects you from the virus or kind of thing, like entrepreneurial ventures. And this is all in the process of becoming, which is thwarted if we don't allow you to engage in commercial activity, because then you don't have the incentive and everything. So it's kind of, it's amazing the politics that are involved in this and the international politics. This goes back to your Russia thing or China or any of these other ones. Where do we get these knowledge from in the scientific community? So in the United States, we're pretty much focused on what's being developed here internally. I think there's going to be 3 or 4 within the next month, which will all be coming online. Difficult it is to have, people are going to say, no, I don't want to have the vaccine. And so how are you going to have compliance to a vaccine at the same time as you respect people's liberty and autonomy? Okay. And so this brings us back to, an age-old question from John Stuart Mill about the harm principle. you know, and all these. So to me, there's so many fascinating questions of a legal, of a moral, of a political nature for us to study. Again, I'm an academic, so I study these things. You want answers to these things. I'm studying them. But to me, I keep on returning to like first principles. And I'm like, okay, so how would, if we applied Mill's harm principle, you know, chapter 5 of On Liberty, and, you know, his first line is that the state has the individual has no responsibility to any other individual, provided that it's their actions don't at all infringe on anyone else. But then his next line is, and he uses the phrase, actions prejudicial to others. So if my action is prejudicial to others, then all of a sudden I have a responsibility to actually maybe be disciplined or whatever. Well, this is a classic example of that, right? And so
it is.
And so now, you know, how do you balance the desire to have liberty and autonomy and freedom of choice with the necessity of protecting your community and all these things like that? And so I think we're going to have serious, again, honest adult conversations about these issues rather than emotional outbursts, you know, that you're evil, you're not. And so I think that hopefully, I mean, I can't wait for the vaccine, and I can't wait to get back to in-person activities, because I miss my in-person teaching. I miss traveling. I miss interacting with people. Zoom has been a great substitute at the moment, but I want it to be
it's not the same. Yeah.
I want it to be a compliment. I don't want it to be a substitute, you know, for my life. And so I want to get back to normalcy as fast as possible. And so I have great hope in science. Yeah.
Professor Boettke, beforehand, you mentioned 3 issues that the US have not been tackling in at least the past few decades. One of them was the way that it has turned into a rent-seeking society. We just had you just had elections last week. Even though one of the contenders still has not acknowledged the results of the election. There's this notion in Argentina, and I think it has been taking place all along Latin America. And this is an adjective that it's actually not a positive one, that we feel from down south that United States politics, American politics, have Latin Americanized in a way, at least in the last couple of years. Would you agree with that idea, and why, Professor Boettke?
So first, let me say the following thing. I do not believe that there's any kind of you know, massive voter fraud. I do think that the normal shenanigans that go on in politics, and in particular machine politics, goes on for both sides. And it just is never of a magnitude that it's actually the determining factor in this regard. But we have a system set up that allows you to explore these various different avenues. And Trump is not the first person to ever do this. I mean, he's the most loud about it, and it's the most central position because it's the president. It's not the local it's not the governor of your state, not the mayor, not the senator or whatever that's running. But we have institutions that are robust, it seems, against silliness. And so as the process works out, and if it goes the way all of us expect, the judges are going to throw the cases out. The state election boards are going to you know, dismiss the charges, and you're going to have a situation where Trump doesn't have any avenues except to concede and move on. He's going to try to do something so that he has a future, and that his movement, whatever the hell you call it, has a future. You know, he's not going to get a show on ABC. You know, he's going to probably have, like, you know, be like Glenn Beck, or, you know, one of these other ones that have an alternative TV show or something. And, you know, he probably is going to prepare to try to run again in 4 years, right? I mean, that's Trump, you know, that's what he's going to try to do. The Republicans are courting him at the moment to stay engaged because they want his energy to help them in Georgia. But, at some point, it just gets silly for them to keep on hooking their cart to this horse, because he is not someone who can ever govern in the middle. He can only govern in the extremes. I should say the following thing so that listeners, especially libertarian listeners, understand a point, is that the establishment, progressive establishment, has been, the administrative state and the deep state have been in operation in the United States for over a century. To get the kind of world that those of us who are libertarian would like to see, that has to be dismantled. Okay, so part of the appeal to some libertarians of Trump was that he seemed to be willing to challenge that apparatus. But Trump himself is not really a challenger. He's actually one of them. All right, he became a wealthy man because he's a master rent seeker, not because he's a master businessman. He's a master rent seeker. And I'm not talking about his taxes. There's a big confusion over the taxes because of politics. He prepaid millions of dollars in taxes. The difference is what he owed at the end of the year, which is like all of us do have any kind of 1099 income. But it's amazing that his accountants were able to whittle down to that. But he paid millions of dollars in taxes. Don't anyone think he just paid $750. But they, people make the claims that they want to make or whatever. But you go back and you look at like the way his real estate deals were and everything like that. He's always been a shyster. He got government to give him tax abatements. He gets government to give him special privileges and everything like that. And then what he did was he oftentimes engaged in very unsavory practice with subcontractors, which he would agree to a deal with a subcontractor for say 100. And then when the deal was done, he'd say, I'll pay you 10. And the subcontractor would say, no, we agreed to 100. And he'd say, take me to court. And they'd say, all right, I don't have the ability to take you to court. Just give me my 10. And so he's done this like forever. All right. So he's a master rent seeker. He's exactly all the problem with the system that we have. Politically privileged people that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. And so he understood the system. He could criticize the system, but he wasn't going to actually ever be the person that tore the system apart and did it in a constructive way. So the fact that he gets associated with that has put the critical movement to challenge the administrative and deep state back about a generation, because now it's all identified with a right-wing populist who was, problematic in the way that he dealt with injustice and immorality and corruption and stuff. So, all right, just put that on the table.
Quite interesting. Let me add, because that's actually a discussion and a debate that's been taking place abroad, because we have also seen quite a big amount of libertarians or so-called libertarians that have been vouching for Donald Trump while he was still before the election and after his loss.
Yeah, I mean, and I can understand why that people are nervous about the new regime, because sometimes they talk as if every dollar that's been earned since 1980 is an unearned dollar, and therefore it can be confiscated. They advocate for the Green New Deal, and they sort of a bunch of different policy things, and I disagree with them on public policy. Right? Seriously. But I do agree. Remember what I said. One of the issues is that we have a problem of structural inequality in America. And one of those issues is actually embedded in our criminal justice system that disproportionately harms segments of our population and leaves others to have second, third, fourth, fifth chances. Okay. So we've over-criminalized a lot of activity, and it disproportionately falls on minority populations, the burden of that. And we need to rethink that. And we do have a problem of, police violence in America, and we have a militarization of police, that this is a reality. It's not a made up issue. right? You know, and a large part of it, again, is maybe bad policies related to the drug war and all kinds of other things which have created issues. But, you know, Trump, one last thing just on Trump is that, you know, there's a false view that prior to COVID, Trump had this economy clicking at unbelievable like levels of growth, right? Again, we weren't at high levels of growth. We were doing okay, and a certain segment of the economy was doing well. And you did have historically low unemployment rates for certain segments of the population, but we also had the highest level of joblessness. So this gets forgotten. You can watch listen to a great episode of Econ Talk with Ed Glazer on the issue of joblessness with Russ Roberts. And you should tell all your listeners to listen to this, because these are people that are no longer looking for a job because they don't have any faith that there is a job for them to have. We were at historic levels in our society at that point.
Yeah, and people who had just given up. And what's going on with that, right? What's going on with that? If you read the book by Deaton and Cates, Deaths of Despair, we have this rise of alcoholism, drug abuse, and suicides that we haven't seen in you know, generations in the US. What was going on? That's all pre-COVID, right? The book was published in March of 2020 based on data collected, you know, for 20 years prior to that. So what has happened in our society is tumultuous and extremely, you know, important for us to get a handle of these issues. And I think that goes back to this issue of the structural inequality. People don't feel that they can be a stakeholder in the American economy like they once thought they could be. And so, and where did that come from? So I think it's misidentified when you say, oh, that came from globalization, or that came from increasing markets, or neoliberalism, or whatever you call it, right? I think what it came from is more state involvement in our labor markets. And this goes back to your question now. So this is where our labor markets became more like Europe than they became like the United States. They became more regulated, more you know, difficult to let go of employees, therefore less probable that you're going to hire employees, right? And with that comes our politics. So what has happened in our politics? Well, one of the things that's happened in our politics is that people want to say that it's about moneyed interest, that there's more and more money coming in and corrupting politics. But if anything we learned in this last election is that money doesn't guarantee wins, right? You know, the Democrats threw hundreds of millions of dollars to try to get Lindsey Graham out, and he didn't win, you know? And other people, Bloomberg spent a ton of money in various different places to try to win. And so money doesn't dictate the outcomes like people want to make in the simple formula. But what has happened is we've had an increasing amount of polarization. And so rather than people governing through compromise, right, they treat everyone else as evil, and I recommend to your listeners a book by Ed Shills called On Civility. And there's an essay in there on civility and liberalism. And in that essay, he distinguishes between machine politics, ideological politics, and responsible politics. And his argument is that civility is necessary at the highest levels of government in order to be able to get responsible government. If you don't have civility at the highest levels, then your politics is going to devolve into either ideological politics or machine politics. And to be honest with you, if you read them closely, what you see in the reality of the world is that ideological politics become operationalized through machine politics. All right. So it all becomes machine politics versus responsible politics. I want us to think again about what it means to have a civil society where we treat one another as one another's dignified equals, that we learn that we rule not through truth claims in politics, but instead through discourse and compromise,
in politics, we leave truth to science, but politics is about compromise. And it's because none of us have a red phone to God, right? None of us can go and say, God, what's the right policy, and put it down. And once we recognize that none of us have that right phone to God, we then recognize that we're just dealing with one another, and we engage in turn taking, so you rule for this night, you rule, and then we go back and forth. And to me, I think this is what, hopefully we can find. And maybe, Trump gave us 4 years in which politics was too important to our lives. And what we need right now is to remember that politics isn't the most important thing in our life. That politics is in fact in the background, and it's best when we don't even pay attention to it because it's not all that important. It's better to have my community, to have my family, to have my own desires and aspirations, my church. These are where life, political life has meaning, is not at some national level of, what's going on when someone tweets, right? But instead, what's going on at my church, and, what's going on my kids, soccer team or football team or whatever, and, being involved in all of that. And maybe if we can get back to that, then we can go forward in a political space which isn't so rife with tensions.
Such clarity, Professor Boettke, on all these issues. We just crossed a couple of minutes ago the 40-minute mark. Okay. We just have a couple of questions, and we will not steal any more time of your day today. You talk about polarization, and there's this big debate that has been taking place in Argentina, but that has replicated in other parts of the world, because it not only deals with particulars and specificities, but it also deals with abstract concepts. And it started in our country, in Argentina, because the president, Alberto Fernandez, went on record saying in one of his speeches that he was against merit, that he didn't believe that merit was a good thing to push forward society. And in that sense, what is your idea on merit, meritocracy? Our president did not mention this author, but we believe that he might have read something of Michael Sandel at some point. What is your idea, or your expert idea on this merit discussion?
So I think the way we measure merit is a function of a variety of the institutions that we find ourselves in. So I think, one of the things that you should ask your president is, when Argentina goes to play in the World Cup, do they want to pick the team based on merit, or do they want to pick the team based on some other system? I think pretty much he would say, I want the best soccer players or football players that can represent Argentina to be playing. I don't really care about any other system there, because I want them to do that. And I think that's true. Where the problem is that in a lot of systems, academia being one of them, is that the merit system is set up as a system of privileges. And we take tests, and then we're awarded privileges on things that are not necessarily tied to performance. So we have merit, but not tied to performance. In a football match, merit is tied to performance. It doesn't matter if a goalie is the best goalie ever in practice, but when they get into the game, the balls just keep going by him, and they're like, hey, that goalie will get pulled as fast as possible, right? So what matters is the tie between the performance and the merit. If the merit system, same thing with any kind of sport, music, you have your state opera, but you want your lead soprano to have a beautiful voice. You don't want the lead soprano to be up there like that, right? That would not be like, and I think it's so. Let me stress this point, because in ancient China, in more recent India, we had merit systems, but they were designed to pick bureaucrats. Okay, and so there's a great study that was done by Andre Schleifer and Robert Vishney, and it's on the allocation of entrepreneurial talent. And their argument is that in societies that reward commerce, industry, entrepreneurship, you're going to see more of the talented young people choose to major in engineering and STEM disciplines. But if your main way to make resources and get command of resources, and no offense to you, is through the political process, you're going to see more people going to lawyers. So what they did was they ran regressions looking at societies where the young people go into becoming lawyers versus young people going into becoming engineers, and then correlated that with economic growth rates. And lo and behold, what do you see? Right? So
lawyers are not useful on that front.
Yeah. And so this has a lot to do, and it's not offense. We need lawyers, right? No one's saying that you don't need any lawyers, but the issue is on the margin, which way am I going to go? And so meritocracy is omnipresent. The manifestations of meritocracy, some of which can be bad, are going to be context specific. So if the institutional rules bias towards giving privileges to some and excluding others in a way that doesn't tie merit to performance, let's get rid of it. Right? Yes, but we're not getting rid of meritocracy. We're getting rid of privileges. The point about liberalism is that liberalism is a system, our kinds of liberalism, is a system in the absence of privileges. That's the point. That's why Smith was against mercantilism. It's why Hayek is against privileges, right? It's why he uses the term law versus legislation. If you look at the way he discusses it, he makes a big thing out of the etymology of the terms. Law is different than legislation because legis comes from the term privileges. So legislation is a privilege that people give. Law is the stare decisis, the evolution of the common law, right? So we want to get a system in the absence of privilege. We'd like to have a political system that exhibits neither discrimination nor domination. So non-discriminatory politics, non-domination or politics, that creates an institutional framework. And if you allow that institutional framework and allow people to give it a go, then what you're going to see is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if given the freedom to pursue it. Whereas in the alternative system, what they're basically saying is extraordinary people can do extraordinary things if we give them the power to do it. And it's that liberty versus power paradigm that has been battling back and forth for a millennium that continues to be the struggle that we face today. And we need to actually be very articulate and defend that. And so, this whole battle over meritocracy is huge at the moment, because it's not that we should be, blind to the privileges that exist, but we shouldn't assume that every system that requires on merit is a bad system.
Professor Boettke, it has been an absolute delight to be chatting with you today. One last question, which might have a short answer or a long answer, you'll decide. Is there something that you would have been like to have been asked, but I didn't?
No, but I'd like to be back on your show in two folds. Once when the book on money and the rule of law is out, and I have another book called The Struggle for a Better World. And I think that your audience there would be into the struggle for a better world, because that's an argument about how we need a full-throated defense of liberalism in the world today, in the context today. So thank you very much for having me on. I was thrilled to be here, and I applaud all of you in Rosario for your commitment to liberalism and to Austrian economics. And I've yet to make the trip down there for the Austrian seminar. And I hope someday, with COVID be gone, that I'll be able to make that trip and enjoy, some good Argentinian steaks.
It was our greatest pleasure, Professor Boettke. We'll love to have you here at Fundación Libertad in Argentina as soon as possible, and to have you again on our show. Even a copy of Living Economics, one of your latest books, made it to Argentina, Rosario. I have it there.
I have tell your listeners that this is my my new book that's just out. It's called The Four Pillars of Economic. Yeah, and you can get it at AIER.
Awesome. So, I actually visited AIER back in January. I had a great time with them. So good mention and good nod to our friends there. So we just spoke with Professor Peter Boettke, University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at George Mason University and Director of the Friedrich Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And we'll see you next time at our show here at Fundación Libertad.